The rain hit the marble steps of the Everleigh Grand Hotel like it was trying to punish the city for its indifference. Cars honked, neon signs flickered against wet pavement, and in the middle of all that chaos, a young man stood frozen outside the glass doors of the hotel's five-star restaurant, staring at a woman he had never met in his life. His name was Ezra, 26 years old, ribs pressing against a torn hoodie 2 sizes too big, fingers trembling not from the cold but from hunger that had become a permanent resident in his stomach. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. Real food, anyway. Not the half-rotten bread from the dumpster behind the bakery on 5th. Through the glass, he could see her. A woman in her 50s, sharp black blazer, diamond earrings catching the chandelier light, sitting alone at a table with more food than she could ever finish. A whole untouched plate of steak, potatoes, something green and expensive he couldn't even name. He didn't know her name. He didn't know she was Eleanor Voss, the billionaire hotel magnate whose face was on business magazines in every airport across the country. All he knew was that she was rich, she was alone, and she had food she wasn't eating. His stomach cramped. He made a decision that would rewrite both their lives. He pushed open the door. The maitre d' spotted him instantly. "Sir, I'm going to need you to—" "Please?" Ezra said, voice cracking, eyes locked on Eleanor's table. "I just need to ask her something." Security moved in fast, hands reaching for his arms. But Ezra was already talking, already close enough for Eleanor to hear him. "Ma'am," he said, breathless, humiliated, but too hungry to care. "If you're not going to finish that, could I have it? Please, I haven't eaten." The restaurant went silent. Forks stopped mid-air. A woman 2 tables over gasped audibly, already reaching for her phone to record the scene. Eleanor Voss looked up, and everything in her chest collapsed. It wasn't his clothes, it wasn't his hunger, it was his eyes. A very specific shade of hazel green that she had spent 20 years trying to forget and had never once succeeded. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry," the maitre d' said quickly, already gesturing for security to remove him. "He won't bother you again." "Wait," Eleanor said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. "Let him go." The security guard hesitated, hand still on Ezra's arm. "Miss Voss, are you sure?" "I said, let him go." Ezra stood there, confused, humiliated, waiting for the second wave of rejection he was certain was coming. Instead, Eleanor pulled out the chair across from her. "Sit," she said. "I don't need charity," Ezra muttered, even as his stomach betrayed him with a loud, ashing growl. "It's not charity," Eleanor said, and something in her voice trembled in a way the staff had never heard before. "Sit down, please." He sat. She slid the plate toward him without a word, watching as he tried and failed to eat slowly, like a man trying to preserve his dignity, while devouring a plate of food in under 2 minutes. She didn't say anything, she just watched his hands, his wrist, the small irregular birthmark just above the base of his thumb, shaped almost like a crescent moon. Her whole body went cold. 20 years earlier, in a mall 3 states away, she had held that exact wrist while zipping up a small blue jacket, kissing a small hand, telling a 6-year-old boy named Daniel that she'd only be 5 minutes, that she just had to take 1 phone call, that he should stay right there by the fountain and not move. She had turned her back for 4 minutes. When she turned around, he was gone. 20 years of search parties, private investigators, sleepless nights, psychics, false leads, a marriage that collapsed under the weight of grief, and a business empire built entirely as a distraction from a hole that never closed. And now a homeless stranger was sitting across from her, eating her leftovers, with her son's exact birthmark on his wrist. "What's your name?" she asked, barely able to keep her voice steady. Ezra swallowed hard, embarrassed. "Ezra," he said. "Ezra Combs." Not Daniel. Not even close. But names could be changed. Names could be given by whoever raised a stolen child and told him lies about where he came from. "Ezra," Eleanor repeated slowly, testing the syllables like they might crack open a truth underneath them. "How old are you?" 26, he said, guarded now, sensing the questions were headed somewhere he didn't understand. "Why are you asking me all this?" "No reason," Eleanor lied, forcing a small, careful smile. I'd like to help you, that's all." Ezra's jaw tightened, old defenses rising fast. I don't need help from a stranger. I don't need pity. It's not pity, she said again, quieter now. I promise you, it's not pity. She reached into her purse, pulled out a card and slid it across the table. There's a position open at one of my hotels. Kitchen staff, entry level, but it comes with housing, real housing. A bed, a shower, 3 meals a day, no strings attached. Ezra stared at the card like it was a trap. In his experience, everything came with strings. Every act of kindness in his life had eventually revealed its hidden cost. Why me? He asked, eyes narrowing. You don't know me. Eleanor's throat tightened. She looked down at his wrist again, at the crescent-shaped mark she could have sworn, in that instant, she remembered kissing goodnight 1,000 times. Call it instinct, she said softly. Please, just take the job. He hesitated for a long moment, pride warring with the desperate, aching need for a bed that wasn't a sidewalk. Finally, he nodded once, sharp and reluctant. Fine, he said, but I'm not taking your charity forever. I'll work for it. That's all I'm asking, Eleanor said. But it wasn't. Not even close. That night, alone in her penthouse, Eleanor didn't sleep. She sat at her desk with an old, worn manila folder she hadn't opened in 3 years. The file her private investigator, Marcus Bell, had compiled during the original search for Daniel. Photographs, hospital records, a note from the surgeon who had operated on her son's hip when he was 4, correcting a minor congenital defect. A description of the birthmark, documented for identification purposes in case he was ever found. Her hands shook as she read the old case notes again, phrases she had memorized like scripture. 6 years old, sandy brown hair, hazel green eyes, crescent-shaped birthmark on right wrist, surgical scar on left hippie approximately 2 inches, responds to Nam Yi Danny. She picked up her phone and called a number she hadn't dialed in years. Marcus, she said when he answered, voice raw. I need you. Tonight. Eleanor, it's almost midnight. What's... I think I found him. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Eleanor, Marcus said carefully, the caution of a man who had watched her chase false leads into breakdowns before. We've been here before, 3 times. You remember what happened last time? I know, she said, cutting him off, her voice breaking for the first time. I know what happened last time, but Marcus, he has the birthmark, the exact one, same wrist, same shape. Another pause, longer this time. Okay, Marcus finally said, send me everything you have. I'll start quietly. No press, no accusations, nothing until we're certain. Agreed? Agreed, Eleanor whispered, and hung up, pressing the folder against her chest, like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Over the next several days, Ezra settled uneasily into his new life at the hotel. A small staff room, 3 meals guaranteed, a uniform that fit him properly for the first time in years. He was suspicious of every kindness, waiting for the catch, flinching whenever a manager approached him too quickly, as if expecting to be told it was all a mistake and he needed to leave. But Eleanor kept finding reasons to be near him. She'd stop by the kitchen to check on operations. She'd linger in doorways when he spoke to other staff, listening to the cadence of his voice, the way he lored, quick, surprised, like he wasn't used to laughing and didn't quite trust it. One evening, she found him alone on the loading dock behind the kitchen, humming softly to himself while he broke down cardboard boxes. She stopped in the doorway, breath caught in her throat. It was the same melody, the same off-key, half-remembered lullaby she used to hum to Daniel every night before bed, a tune with no real name, one she'd made up herself, one that had never existed anywhere else in the world. Where did you learn that song? She asked, unable to stop herself. Ezra looked up, startled. What song? The one you were just humming? He shrugged, uncomfortable. I don't know. I've just always known it. Since I was a kid, I guess. Weird, right? Not weird, Eleanor said, voice trembling. Not weird at all. She excused herself before he could see the tears threatening to spill, walking briskly down the hallway until she reached an empty stairwell, where she finally let herself sink onto the cold concrete steps and cry the way she hadn't allowed herself to cry in years. That weekend, she invited him to dinner again, this time framed as a mentorship check-in, a boundary she desperately needed to maintain the illusion of professional distance. Over the meal, she carefully, gently, began asking about his childhood. "I don't really remember much before I was maybe 7 or 8, Ezra admitted, staring down at his plate. "My dad, well, the man who raised me, Robert, he always said my mom died when I was really young. Car accident, he said. He never wanted to talk about it, got angry if I asked too many questions." Eleanor's pulse hammered in her ears. "Do you remember anything at all? Before Robert?" Ezra frowned like he was reaching into a fog that had never fully cleared. "Sometimes I get flashes. A woman's voice, bright lights, like a mall maybe, a fountain. I used to think I made it up. Robert said I had an overactive imagination." "What else?" Eleanor pressed, unable to stop herself now, leaning forward across the table. "I don't know," Ezra said, voice tightening, visibly unsettled by his own missing memories. "Why does this matter so much to you? You're asking me like it's some kind of test." Eleanor caught herself, forcing her expression back into something calmer than what she felt. "I'm sorry, I find people's stories interesting, that's all." But it wasn't all, and some small, sharp instinct in Ezra's chest told him she was lying. 3 days later, Marcus called with results from the surface-level background check. "Eleanor, this isn't going to be easy to hear," he said. "Robert Combs, the man who raised him, has no legal adoption records, no guardianship paperwork, nothing. He simply appears in public records starting the year Ezra would have been 6 years old, in a town 400 miles from where Daniel disappeared." Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles went white. "That's the same year." "I know," Marcus said grimly. "There's more. I pulled financial records. Robert Combs had significant unexplained cash deposits that year, the kind of money that doesn't come from a regular job. Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "I'm saying it's starting to look less like a runaway situation and more like a transaction." Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her. Someone had sold her son. Some stranger had taken her 4-minute distraction at a mall and turned it into a payday, handing her child off to a man who spent the next 2 decades lying to him about where he came from. "I need the DNA test moved up," Eleanor said, voice shaking with a fury she hadn't felt in years. "Today, however, you need to get it done." "Eleanor, listen to me," Marcus said carefully. "If this is real, if he really is Daniel, you cannot go into this angry. You go in careful or you'll lose him before you even get to keep him." She closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe. "Get me the sample," she whispered. "Please, Marcus, I need to know." 2 days later, under the guise of a routine employee wellness check offered to all new hires, Eleanor arranged for a private clinic to draw blood from Ezra, never once telling him the real reason behind the test. He complained about the inconvenience, grumbled about corporate overreach, but complied, unaware that the swab pressed gently against his cheek was about to detonate every carefully constructed lie he'd been told about his own life. Eleanor sat in her office that night, phone in hand, a message from the lab waiting, unopened. The little envelope icon glowing on her screen like something radioactive. She stared at it for 11 full minutes. Her hand trembled over the screen. And just as her thumb finally hovered over the notification, her office door burst open. It was Ezra, furious, a crumpled printout in his shaking hand. "What is this?" he demanded, voice cracking with betrayal. "Someone at that clinic just told me this wasn't a normal wellness check. They said it was a paternity-style DNA panel. What the hell is going on, Eleanor? What did you do?" Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, the unopened results still glowing on her phone screen. 20 years of hope and grief colliding in a single, unbearable moment. "Ezra," she whispered, voice breaking. I think I might be your mother." The silence that followed was the loudest thing either of them had ever heard. Ezra didn't move, didn't blink. For a long moment, the only sound in the office was the hum of the air conditioning and the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen, 3 floors below. "That's not funny," he finally said, his voice low, dangerous. "That is not something you joke about." "I'm not joking," Eleanor said, standing slowly, her hands trembling at her sides. "Ezra, please, just sit down. Let me explain everything." "Explain what?" His voice cracked, rising now, anger and confusion tangled together. Explain why you've been staring at my wrist since the day I met you. Explain why you had some private investigator running background checks on the man who raised me. You think I didn't notice, Eleanor? You think I'm stupid? I never thought you were stupid, she said, tears finally breaking free and sliding down her face. I think you're my son. I have thought it since the moment you sat down at my table. Stop, Ezra said, backing toward the door, chest heaving. Just stop talking. 20 years ago, Eleanor pressed on, desperate now, knowing she might never get another chance to say this if he walked out that door. I had a son, Daniel. He was 6 years old. We were at a shopping mall, and I got a phone call, and I turned my back for 4 minutes, Ezra, and when I turned around, he was gone. Vanished. No trace, no ransom note, nothing. I spent every dollar I had searching for him. I hired investigators in every state. I never stopped looking, not for one single day in 20 years. Ezra's hand found the door frame, gripping it like it was the only solid thing left in the room. That has nothing to do with me. He had a birthmark, Eleanor continued, voice shaking. Right here. She touched her own wrist, the exact spot, crescent-shaped, and a scar on his hip from a surgery when he was 4, and he used to hum a lullaby I made up myself, one that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, because I wrote it for him the night he was born. Ezra's face went pale, his breathing turned shallow. That's a coincidence. Is it? Eleanor whispered. Ezra, look at me. Please, just look at me. He did, and for the first time he let himself really look, at the shape of her features he'd never once thought to compare to his own reflection, because he'd never had a reason to. The lab results just came in, Eleanor said, holding up her phone, hand shaking so hard the screen blurred. I haven't opened them. I was too afraid. Please, please let me open them with you here. Whatever it says, I need you to hear it with me. Ezra stared at the phone like it was a loaded weapon, his jaw clenched, unclenched, clenched again. Open it, he said, finally, voice barely audible. Eleanor's thumb hovered over the notification. She pressed it. The screen loaded, for what felt like an eternity, 3 seconds that stretched into something unbearable. And then the words appeared. Probability of maternal match, 99.98%. Eleanor's knees buckled. She grabbed the edge of her desk to keep from collapsing entirely, a sound tearing out of her chest that was somewhere between a sob and a scream, 20 years of grief finally finding an exit. Ezra didn't move. He stared at the screen over her shoulder, reading the number again and again, like if he looked hard enough it might change into something less impossible. No, he whispered. No, this can't be real. Ezra! Robert told me my mother died, he said, voice rising, cracking apart at the seams. He told me she died in a car accident when I was a baby. He told me that every single time I asked. Every single time. He lied to you, Eleanor said, stepping toward him. Someone took you from me, Ezra. Someone sold you to him. You didn't run away, and I didn't abandon you. Someone stole 20 years from both of us. Don't touch me, Ezra said sharply, flinching back as she reached for him, and Eleanor froze, hands suspended in the air, heart shattering all over again. I need to think. I need to breathe. This is too much. I understand, she said quickly, pulling her hand back, forcing herself to stay calm even as everything inside her was screaming to hold on to him and never let go again. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere. I have been not going anywhere for 20 years, Ezra. I'm not starting now. He left without another word, walking fast down the hallway, down the stairs, out into the rain-slicked street, gasping for air like a man drowning on dry land. He didn't return to the hotel that night, or the next. Eleanor didn't sleep either night, pacing her penthouse, phone gripped in her hand, terrified that the truth had shattered the fragile trust they'd only just begun building. Marcus urged her to give him space. Everything in her screamed to chase him down. She forced herself to listen to reason, even as reason felt like torturer. On the third night, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Ezra standing there, soaked from the rain, eyes red-rimmed and raw, a crumpled photograph in his hand, An old picture he must have found somewhere of himself as a small boy he didn't recognize. "I found this in a box Robert left me," he said, voice hoarse, "buried under a floorboard. There's more. Photos of me as a baby that don't match anything he ever told me. A receipt for a storage unit. A name, a man named Victor Reyes. Do you know that name?" Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Victor Reyes had been her head of household staffing 20 years ago. A man with access to her family's schedule. A man who had quietly resigned 3 weeks after Daniel disappeared and was never seen again. "Yes," she whispered. "I know exactly who that is." "Then you need to tell me everything," Ezra said, stepping inside, voice shaking with a fury that had nowhere else to go. "Everything. Right now." Marcus arrived within the hour, laptop open, files spread across Eleanor's dining table like evidence at a crime scene, because that's exactly what it was. 20 years of buried financial records, cross-referenced bank transfers, and one name that kept surfacing again and again: Victor Reyes. He had gambling debts, Marcus explained, sliding a printout across the table. Serious ones, owed money to some very dangerous people. 3 weeks after Daniel disappeared, those debts were paid in full, in cash, no explanation. Around the same time, a man named Robert Combs shows up 400 miles away with a 6-year-old boy and enough money to disappear quietly. Ezra's hands curled into fists on the table. "You're saying he sold me, like I was property." "I'm saying the evidence points that way," Marcus said gently. "I'm sorry, son." The word son hung in the air and nobody corrected him. "Where is Victor Reyes now?" Ezra asked, voice flat and cold in a way that frightened even Eleanor. "We found him," Marcus said. "Small apartment 2 hours outside the city. He's been living quietly under a slightly altered name for years." "I want to see him," Ezra said. "Tonight." "Ezra," Eleanor started. "I need to hear it from him," Ezra said, turning to her, eyes blazing with 20 years of unanswered questions. "I need to look him in the eyes and hear him say what he did. You owe me that much, Eleanor. You owe me the truth, all of it, and I'm not waiting one more day." She couldn't argue with that. She'd waited 20 years for this same truth. She understood, more than anyone alive, what it felt like to need an answer so badly, it became the only thing keeping you upright. "Okay," she said quietly. "We'll go together." The apartment building was exactly as unremarkable as Marcus had described: flickering hallway lights, peeling paint, the smell of old carpet and cigarette smoke. Eleanor's hands shook as she knocked on apartment 4C, Ezra standing rigid beside her, jaw tight enough to crack. The man who opened the door had aged badly, thinner, greyer, eyes sunken with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent 2 decades running from himself. The colour drained from his face the instant he saw Eleanor. "Eleanor Voss," he breathed. How did you—" "Victor," Eleanor said, voice deadly calm, the calm of a woman who had imagined this moment 10,000 times. "This is my son, Daniel. I believe you two have already met, 20 years ago." Victor's eyes shifted to Ezra, and something in his face collapsed entirely. Recognition, guilt, 20 years of buried terror finally surfacing all at once. "I can explain," Victor stammered, backing into his apartment. "Then explain," Ezra said, following him inside, voice shaking with barely restrained rage. "Tell me why a man I called my father for 20 years lied to me every single day of my life. Tell me why I grew up thinking my mother was dead. Tell me why I've been sleeping on sidewalks for the last 2 years while she—" His voice broke, pointing at Eleanor, "was building hotels and searching for me in every city in this country." "I owed people money," Victor said, collapsing into a chair, hands shaking violently. "Dangerous people. They said if I didn't pay, they'd hurt my family. I saw an opportunity. I knew a man, Robert, who couldn't have children, who wanted a son desperately. I told him you were an orphan, who needed a home. I told myself it wasn't really stealing, that you'd have a good life either way. You told yourself a lie to sleep at night," Ezra spat. "You sold a 6-year-old boy to cover a gambling debt." "I was going to tell someone eventually," Victor said weakly. "I swear I was going to—" "20 years," Eleanor said, voice trembling with a fury that had waited 2 decades to be unleashed. "20 years, Victor. I lost my marriage. I lost years of my life to grief you could have ended with one phone call. "I'm sorry," Victor whispered, tears finally falling. "I am so sorry." "Sorry doesn't give me back 20 years," Ezra said quietly, and something in his voice had shifted, not less angry, but exhausted, hollowed out. "Sorry doesn't undo any of this." Marcus, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward. "The police are already on their way," he said. "I called them the moment we confirmed the address. This isn't something that ends with an apology, Victor. This is a crime. Kidnapping. Trafficking. You're going to answer for every year of it." Victor didn't resist when the police arrived 20 minutes later. He simply sat, broken and small, finally facing the consequences he'd spent 20 years running from. Outside, in the cold night air, Ezra stood on the curb staring blankly at nothing, chest rising and falling unsteadily. Eleanor approached carefully, unsure if he wanted her anywhere near him. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. "No," Ezra admitted, voice raw. "I don't think I know how to be okay right now. Everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie. My name, my father, even the reason I ended up on the street, none of it was real, none of it was supposed to happen." "I know," Eleanor said, her own voice cracking. "I'm not going to pretend I understand exactly what you're feeling, but I do know what it's like to have your whole life split into a before and after. Mine split the day you disappeared. Yours is splitting right now. I need you to know, whatever you decide, whatever you need, I am not going anywhere. Not this time. Not ever again." Ezra turned to look at her, eyes glassy, 26 years of hardened defenses cracking at the edges. "I don't know how to just be your son," he admitted. "I don't know how to undo 20 years of thinking I was alone in the world." "You don't have to know how," Eleanor said gently. "We can figure it out together, slowly, however long it takes." He didn't hug her. He didn't say the words she desperately wanted to hear, but he didn't walk away either. He stood beside her on that curb, in the cold, in the aftermath of the truth, and for the first time in 20 years, neither one of them was alone. The weeks that followed were not the fairy tale reunion either of them had imagined. There were nights Ezra disappeared for hours without explanation, overwhelmed by a new life he hadn't asked for. There were arguments, sharp, painful ones, where 20 years of grief on both sides collided messily. Eleanor had to learn that being his mother again wasn't something she could rush or purchase or fix with money. Ezra had to learn that trusting someone wasn't a weakness, even after a lifetime of being told otherwise. Slowly, painstakingly, something began to shift. Eleanor stopped pushing him to move into the penthouse and instead helped him find a small apartment of his own, his choice, his pace. She stopped introducing him to board members as "my son Daniel," and instead let him decide in his own time which name felt like his. He chose Ezra. It was the only piece of his stolen life he wanted to keep for himself. 3 months later, Ezra stood in front of a small building Eleanor had quietly purchased at his request, not as a gift, but as a joint investment, something he insisted on paying toward from his own earnings. A shelter and resource centre for homeless youth, with a particular focus on trafficking survivors and kids who had fallen through every crack the system had to offer. He'd named it the Fountain Project, after the place where his life had been stolen from him 20 years earlier, a place he'd decided to reclaim rather than run from. On opening night, Eleanor stood at the back of the room, watching her son speak to a crowd of reporters, volunteers, and formerly homeless teenagers who looked at him not with pity, but with recognition. "I spent 2 years on the street," Ezra said into the microphone, voice steady in a way it hadn't been 3 months earlier. "I know what it feels like to be invisible, to ask a stranger for scraps because you have nothing left. I also know what it feels like to be given a second chance you never expected. This place exists because everyone deserves that chance. Not because they're lucky, but because they're human." The room erupted into applause. Eleanor wiped her eyes discreetly, watching the boy she'd lost become a man. She was only just beginning to know and falling in love with him all over again in this new, unexpected shape. After the event, as the crowd thinned, Ezra found her by the door. "I got us a table," he said quietly. "That restaurant, the one where we met." Eleanor's breath caught. "Ezra, you don't have to—" "I want to," he said. "I have something to say to you there, something I couldn't say 3 months ago." They sat at the same table, the same restaurant, rain streaking the same windows. It had the night everything changed. The waiter approached, and before Eleanor could order, Ezra held up a hand. "Two of the same meal," he told the waiter, "and bring an extra plate." When the food arrived, Ezra slid his plate toward her, mirroring deliberately, painfully, beautifully, the exact moment that had brought them together. "You didn't have to give me a life," he said, voice thick with emotion. "You could have just let me go that night, called security, walked away. But you didn't. You gave me a seat at your table when you had every reason not to trust a stranger asking for scraps." "You're not a stranger," Eleanor said, tears sliding freely down her face now. "You never were. You were mine. Before you ever sat down at that table, Ezra, I just didn't know it yet." "I know, I still have a long way to go," Ezra said, reaching across the table to take her hand, the first time he had ever willingly touched her. "But I want to try. I want to know what it's like to have a mother. If you're willing to be patient with me." "I have been patient for 20 years, Eleanor whispered, gripping his hand like she'd never let go again. "I can wait as long as it takes." Outside, the rain kept falling against the glass, but inside that restaurant, for the first time in 2 decades, neither one of them felt cold anymore. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now, because these reunions deserve to be seen. Drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit you hardest: the leftovers scene, the DNA results, or the confrontation with Victor. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because next week's story is going to break your heart in the best possible way. See you in the next one.